In the pages of horror fiction, a monster is not just something that poses a threat, but which also contaminates or corrupts. Sometimes it's moral contamination, as when Dracula forces you to be his servant and do horrible things. Other times it's psychological contamination, as when a monster like Cthulhu gets inside your mind. In other cases, a monster contaminates your very identity, taking you and making you one of them, as with zombie hordes or pod people. And perhaps most commonly of all, a monster threatens physical corruption, to poison you, intoxicate you, take bad things from the outside of your body and put them inside your body. This is a way of saying that monsters are a source of disgust as well as fear. And there are few monsters as disgusting as those drawn from industrial hellscapes. Junkyards, oil spills, old factories, wreckages, and old cleanup sites are all candidates for a lair for this sort of monster. And we will be appealing to pollution and eco-horror in today's adventure. Welcome to PhD&D, everyone. I'm Dr. Bowers, and today we're going to talk about the Ravenloft Domain of Nosos, a land way back from the 2nd edition of this setting whose name means disease in Greek. As with all my Ravenloft videos, we'll talk about what this domain is, list some media to help us get an imaginative grip on it, and then sketch out an adventure. In this case, the adventure is a little toxic jaunt that takes PCs from level 7 to level 8, that is, they will finish the adventure at level 8, and with DM's permission at the end, level up to 9. Our adventure will use elements from Eberron Rising from the Last War, Ghosts of Saltmarsh, and Keys from the Golden Vault. Before we get started, however, what is the domain of Nosos? Well, in the smog-blanketed land of Nosos, the sun's strangled light barely reaches the oil-covered ground. Garbage and trash are absolutely everywhere, and the reek of their collective decay is enough to kill birds flying in the sky. Meager shacks and scattered shantytowns lean drunkenly against each other as they crowd around the industrial base of factories and lumber mills. Ruling over all of this is the Baron Malus Scalaris, murderer to his druid parents, and hater of all things natural. He profits immensely from his destructive and toxic businesses, but even if he didn't, he would do the same thing anyway because he hates the greenery so much. Nosos first appeared in the 2nd edition Ravenloft supplement Islands of Terror, and it was never brought back for 5th edition. I've always found it to be a rather fascinating domain, however, particularly because it's such a modern setting with such modern problems. The horror of Nosos is ecological and industrial. The air is toxic and polluted, the water is toxic and polluted, the soil is toxic and polluted, the animals and the beasts and the monsters are all eerie and mutated, everybody is poor. It's as if Christopher Nolan directed a Captain Planet episode. And to help us get an imaginative grip on this setting, here's some media to consider. First, and perhaps most obviously, is Upton Sinclair's 1906 classic, The Jungle. This famous piece documents the story of a Lithuanian immigrant and the struggle of his family to make ends meet amidst the immigrant workforce in a pre-labor movement United States. But it also contains many disgusting and horrific portrayals of urban decay and corruption. Toxic food, toxic pollution, unsafe working conditions, and poverty are all staples of Nosos, and you find them aplenty in The Jungle. I also recommend the 1926 short story The Night Wire by A.F. Arnold. This fascinating and influential short story covers not only fears of decay and of smog and pollution, but also of technology and of working with technology when it's new. I jokingly referred to this the other evening as telegraph horror or typewriter horror, and that's a good description for it. It's a really short piece, but very spooky. Highly recommended. I also recommend Leonora Carrington's 1941 story, White Rabbits, is an unusual example of surrealist literature that is also horror literature. Like The Night Wire, this is a short fiction piece, but it is very horrific, portraying not only urban decay, but the weirdness of urban life. Published that same year is Fritz Leiber's Smoke Ghost. It's the tale of a distinctly modern industrial-era ghost whose face is blackened with coal smoke and whose interior pounds with a rhythm of industrial machinery. The language used to describe the titular monster is particularly effective and poetic, and I'd recommend lifting some of its descriptions if you decide to have some oily, greasy smoke ghosts in your Nosos campaign. There's also Harlan Ellison's 1973 work of fiction, The Whimper of Whipped Dogs. This is a fascinating eldritch horror story about an elder god of New York who is battened by and feeds off of all of the cruelty and hatred and filth that New York City generates. Absolutely fascinating. There's also the 1979 sci-fi horror film Prophecy, directed by John Frankenheimer. While not a perfect film, this is a classic bloody, grisly example of what you get if you try to make eco-horror and focus on the mutated beasts and creatures that result from industrial pollution. There's also Bong Joon-ho's 2006 horror film The Host. This is one of my favorite monster movies, but it's also a piece of ecological horror, especially when thinking about the genesis of the monster and what the overall message of the film is. And finally, of course, I recommend the 1992 second edition Ravenloft supplement, Islands of Terror, written by Colin McComb and Scott Benny. As I mentioned before, this is the work that first presented Nosos as a domain, and to date, this is the only official release that mentions that setting. Okay, with influences out of the way, let's sketch out this adventure. Our adventure is a short two-part romp through an industrial wasteland, where we mix elements from the Styes in Ghosts of Saltmarsh, a map from Eberron Rising from the Last War, a couple of encounters including one from Nerdarchy's Out of the Box, and the 8th level adventure, Heart of Ashes, from Keys from the Golden Vault. In Act 1, at level 7, PCs arrive in Nosos, encounter some horrible monsters, have an opportunity to make a friend, and learn about the role of Malus Scalaris, the Dark Lord in plaguing the land. Then, in Act 2, at level 8, the PCs journey to Malus Scalaris' decrepit, smog-filled mansion, one that is now blasted apart and floating in chunks in toxic magic. And at that point, we run Heart of Ashes from Keys from the Golden Vault, and just change a few things, names, and general aesthetics in order to fit Nosos. So let's go into this adventure in detail. In Act 1, at level 7, the PCs arrive in the domain of Nosos. Here, I think the easiest thing to do is to just let the mists deposit the PCs in the domain. No matter where they were before, there's a gust of wind and a cloud of mist, it envelops them and then deposits them in this land. For thematic purposes, however, I would add that when the PCs arrive, the mist has transformed into an acrid, foul-smelling smog, one whose odor clings to the air even after the cloud clears. For a map of where the PCs arrive, I would use the map of Sharn Heights from Eberron Rising from the Last War, and just change a few things. First of all, instead of a precipitous drop, anywhere there isn't a road should be filled with garbage and corrupted soil. This isn't a skyway, the roads are on the ground. To that end, I'd also eliminate the docked airship that's there, and just make sure the road is covered in oil slicks, the sky is filled with polluting clouds, and that garbage and trash are everywhere. The first thing that the PCs notice, indeed, should be the stench. Give the PCs a few moments to react, maybe pick through the garbage. There's nothing useful in there, unless you want there to be. And then, out of the trash leaps a hungry and territorial Utyug. It attacks the PCs immediately, and, toward the end of the fight, we're going to run the encounter 1 Crow, 2 Crow, 3 Crow, Scarecrow from Nerdarchy's Out of the Box. Basically what happens is there are a number of vaguely humanoid-shaped piles of trash, which, with a start, suddenly start moving towards the PCs and attacking them. We're going to give each of these things the statistics of a Harvest Scarecrow from that same Nerdarchy book, and we're doing this for 2 reasons. First, when you strike a Harvest Scarecrow, there's a chance that a bunch of dust and debris will fly up and blind you. We're going to say that that's just trash and filth flying up when you strike them. And also, Harvest Scarecrows have a neat ability called Hay Fever, where they can force a PC to make a saving throw, or else start coughing and sneezing uncontrollably, forfeiting their next action. Again, we can say this is due to more trash or smog that these creatures create. Newly described as creatures made of trash and garbage, I would call them garbage golems, but they have the statistics, the exact statistics of Harvest Scarecrows. Because the PCs are at level 7, they're fighting an Utyug, and the Harvest Scarecrows statistics are a CR1, I would throw maybe 4 or 5 Harvest Scarecrows, garbage golems, at the PCs, just as they're finishing the fight with the Utyug. After the battle, the toxic air regains some semblance of calm, and the PCs have a chance to explore this weird domain of Nosos. As they do, I would use random encounters from the adventure The Styes from Ghosts of Saltmarsh. Those encounters are intended for player characters of level 11, so I would scale back the number of hostile beings that PCs encounter in each of those. Maybe they're attacked by 6 veterans instead of 10, that sort of thing. In addition to taking random encounters from that adventure The Styes, let's also take the general description of it as a toxic wasteland and the mechanic of the red face disease, this weird affliction that infects the general population. They get it from breathing the polluted air, and it causes their face to turn red and has a couple of other deleterious symptoms. Take that mechanic and put it in Nosos 2. Now, eventually, after the PCs have had a few of these random encounters and explored the domain for a little bit, they should hear a voice yelling for help, and, turning their attention to it, they should find a young man who's in a cage suspended way off the ground, like Mad Mardigan in Willow from 1988. His name is Ichabod, but he goes by Icky, and getting him down should be a task. Not a task that the PCs can't handle, but one which should prompt them to do a little bit of brainstorming, teamwork, and imaginative exploration to try to get this guy down. And once the PCs get Icky down from his suspended cage, he explains that his fellow townsfolk trapped him up there after he was caught trying to steal a cup of clean water to drink, adding that that sort of stuff is rare around here. Icky will explain that the land is called Nosos and that it's ruled by a baron, Malus Scalaris, who hates nature. Icky laments because, not long ago, indeed within living memory, the land was once beautiful and green. This is back when Malus Scalaris' father, Zeno Scalaris, a druid, ruled the land. Zeno was good, and under his rule the land was clean. But, as everybody knows, Malus slayed his father, and, using his father's own beating heart as a source of magic, as a talisman, took over the land, converted it into this industrial wasteland that he profits from. And now everybody lives in poison. Icky adds that recently things have gotten much, much worse. The Dark Lord Scalaris is no longer able to control the power that he summoned from his father's beating heart, and so it's begun to corrupt him as well, and the mansion in which he dwells. And at this point, Icky will point in the distance toward a castle-like mansion on a hill, barely visible through sheets of smog, whose upper levels hang suspended, crumbling in the air, cradled by curls and waves of smog, as though being hugged affectionately by the land's pollution. Icky indicates that that is where Malus Scalaris lives, and Icky also describes how people try to leave the land of Nosos but are unable to, inevitably coming up into a wall of smog that sends them back from whence they came. Although he is too cowardly himself to effect such a deed, Icky suggests that maybe the PCs could go to Malus Scalaris' abode, confront him there, wrench the power of Zeno's heart from Scalaris' grasp, and restore the land to, well, if not greenery, at least something less toxic. And assuming the PCs agree, they level up, we proceed to Act 2, and then we run the adventure Heart of Ashes from Keys from the Golden Vault. Now, this adventure is really, really fun. The PCs are climbing through a castle, and because the castle is separated into different chunks, some of which are airborne, they need to climb and jump and leap from one part of the castle to another. Plus, the castle is full of all kinds of interesting monsters. They're mostly just guards, yes, but the guards have been infused with fire and ash so that they have the creature type of elemental and immunity to fire damage. I would add immunity to poison damage as well to fit with the whole pollution theme, and I would describe them as being more smoggy than smoky. Make sure the interior of the mansion is full of disgusting polluted boot prints and handprints on things. And of course, change the corrupted body of the king and his heart to the corrupted body of Scalaris' father Zeno and his heart. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, we're going to change the character of Charmaine into the character of Malus Scalaris. Describe him as wearing like a business suit or some kind of Victorian suited attire, even though he's obviously corrupted by the pollution. Also, make sure that you just skip the prologue to this adventure. Jump right into the PCs approaching the mansion. We don't need of the elaborate setup or backstory because we're taking the adventure, putting it in a new setting, Nosos, and the PCs already have a quest giver in Icky. So just take Heart of Ashes from Keys from the Golden Vault and run it that way. Should the PCs succeed in defeating Malus Scalaris, they're in for a fun, adventuresome treat, because a bunch of pieces of that castled mansion are going to plummet to the ground with a crash. Can they avoid being crushed? Can they avoid taking damage? If so, how? They're level 8, so they should have a number of abilities at their disposal. And of course, in the wake of the Dark Lord's apparent and, obviously, temporary destruction, the air seems to clear just a little bit. A breeze, fresh and cool, caresses the PC's faces. Is that a glimmer of green grass growing up between the bits of trash that otherwise contaminate the soil? Or perhaps it's a false hope, soon to be crushed when the Dark Lord returns. And as for the PCs, do they remain here? Or do the Ravenloft mists once again come up and scoop them away and take them to another location? That's up to you. But that's our short little adventure in this tiny domain of Nosos. What do you think? Too brief? Too obscure? And what are your thoughts on introducing eco-horror to Ravenloft? Let me know in the comments. And before we conclude, please note, we have less than 6 days on my Kickstarter, 5 Acts The King in Yellow RPG. This is an original TTRPG that I designed and meticulously tested with a close team over 20 months. It's full of neat storytelling mechanics. It's a love letter to the short stories of Robert W. Chambers and his 1895 anthology, The King in Yellow. It's got amazing art, lore, the original short stories, some new short stories, and more. It's a hardcover book of over 200 pages, written by me, and it's cheaper than a couple of movie tickets. There's very little time left. Please, if you've enjoyed any of the videos on this channel, help support it by pledging in this Kickstarter. It's an awesome book, well priced, you'd be helping me out, and you're going to get this amazing game. Go to Kickstarter today, pledge your support for the Yellow Sign in Carcosa, survive your nightmares, conquer the world, and I'll see you in the next video.